Hello, everyone, and welcome to People's Light interview Q&A with Madeline Miller, author of Song of Achilles. As most of you likely know, we're doing Hurricane Diane right now, which is a Greek based sort of play based around Greek theater, Greek mythology. It also touches on permaculture as well as lesbian romance. And we became a book sanctuary around this play as well to sort of protect banned books that hit along some of those themes too. So we were lucky enough to get to chat with Madeline Miller today and talk about her work, how it intersects with some of those themes, and just generally open up for questions for those of you who have read the book either recently or in the past. My name is Nora Gare. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the community programs associate here at People's Light, and I'll turn it over to Madeline to introduce yourself and a little bit about what you've done.
Sure. I'm so thrilled to be here. I absolutely love this play and I've loved it for a long time. So I'm very excited to get to talk about adaptation in general, which is, of course, also my passion. So I grew up in this area. I actually went to school at Shipley and I had a wonderful Latin teacher there who I fell in love with Latin and with mythology. I was already in love with those things, but he really kind of gave me the tools, and he also taught me ancient Greek. So I headed off to college knowing that I wanted to do that. And at the same time that I was obsessed with becoming a classicist over here, I wanted to be a writer. And they were really two totally separate impulses. I never considered that I could put the two things together. I wanted to be a classicist and, read Latin and Greek, and then I wanted to be a writer. And so at the same time that I was studying all this ancient literature, my models for writing were actually contemporary authors. My favorite writers kind of from high school on up were Margaret Atwood and James Baldwin, Isabel Allende and Amy Tan, Laurie Moore. These were kind of the brilliant contemporary authors of the day, and they were the people that I was sort of looking to as a model. So, I continued to study these things. And then at some point I had a lightning bolt that I could actually put these two things together, that I could write about classics and I could take all that passion I had for classics and sort of the academic side of classics and combine it with my love for writing. And the thing that actually let me make that connection finally was theater. So I credit theater with basically everything. Everything in my life comes from theater. So I'm so excited to be getting to, do this now with People's Light, because I so appreciate what they do in the world. What happened was that I was asked to co-direct a production of Troilus and Cressida, which is Shakespeare's version of the Iliad. And so it's Shakespeare's adaptation. And it's a very interesting play. I don't know if any of you out there have seen Troilus and Cressida. I highly recommend it. It's one of his angriest, bitterest, funniest plays. He really lets all these ancient characters have it. I mean, Hector, Cassandra, Helen, Achilles, Agamemnon, they're all in there. And Shakespeare basically just, brutally mocks and sends up and is acidic towards all of them. So it's a very interesting, dark, disturbing, but very funny play. But as I was working on it, it was so exciting for me to get to actually, interact with these characters in a way I hadn't before. Interact with them. I'm deliberately not saying creatively, because I do think that academic work is creative, but interact with them where I got to be part of shaping the story. And I got to be part of sort of imagining how Achilles might move through the space, or how the sword fight might look, or how the dynamic played out between Cassandra and her family. All of those things, getting to be part of creating that with the actors was so exciting that when I was done with that play, I didn't want to stop. And up to that point, I was working towards my master's in classics. I had planned to write my master's thesis on interpretations of Achilles and Patroclus as lovers through the centuries. And if any of you have read or heard of Song of Achilles, you know where all that research went. Because what I basically decided is that the argument I wanted to make about Achilles and Patroclus and their relationship was an emotional argument, and it needed a novel in order to make that argument. the way I wanted to make it. So from the beginning, sort of these two pieces have always been together for me. Now, we were going to talk, I can go more into my story, but I don't want to talk too much. So, cut me off, because I know we want to talk about adaptation as well.
No, I think that's a great place to sort of take it to dig into more adaptation there. I think Madeleine George, who wrote Hurricane Diane, two phenomenal Madeleine authors we have here, talks about this not as a retelling of the Bacchae, but as a sort of spiritual successor. And so with that, I think, especially something like a sequel, there comes a responsibility or a reverence of some kind for original material. So how do you feel the balance is between, yeah, that emotional argument, the creative side, not to differentiate it from the academic, and then perhaps the historical interpretation, the way it's usually interpreted, versus something taking the usual interpretation and adding your own flair to it?
That's such a great question. And the answer for this, I'm going to distinguish between when I'm talking about historical fiction versus what I call kind of mythological realism or mythological adaptation. So if I were writing historical fiction about someone who had really lived, I would absolutely feel that responsibility because I was dealing with someone's real life. But with mythology, there are so many different versions of every story. There is no definitive version of a myth. You can talk about, Homer's version and Virgil's version and Ovid and Shakespeare's version and Chaucer, and you can talk about Margaret Atwood and Derek Walcott and like kind of down through the centuries and Madeleine George's version, but there is no definitive version of a myth. And so while I feel that deep connection to the source material because I come from a classics background, I actually don't think you need to be that close to the material to have a successful adaptation or, spiritual successor, or however you're kind of framing that as the artist. Because the truth is that, the ancients would argue with each other all the time about the way these myths were supposed to be interpreted. And they would innovate and change things. And then, it happened all the time and they were very accustomed to it. And then at some point, we kind of got the idea that there's one or two versions of the story and we sort of have to be faithful. And that word faithful, it usually comes up right away whenever you're talking about kind of any sort of adaptation or translation, is how faithful is it to the original? And I feel like that's such a loaded word. It makes me feel like I need to be Penelope sitting in my, in the Odyssey, being faithful to Odysseus and sort of coloring within the lines and, being very careful. So I just want to say that I feel very strongly that a successful adaptation has nothing to do with how so-called faithful it is to the original work. That you can have works that are quite close to the original, that have no life, no spirit, they're kind of airless. And then you can have works that are quite far away that are totally successful and exciting. I always love when a work of adaptation makes me completely forget the source material. And that's happened a couple different times. Home Fire by Kamla Shamsi is one of my favorite novels. It's based on Antigone. And it's one of my favorite adaptation novels. And I was reading and I was totally enraptured in the novel. And then about halfway through, I was like, oh no, this is based on Antigone. This is not going to end well, but I had completely forgotten that. So, I love that. But also I love when a writer just does something totally new with the source material. I love Tayari Jones's An American Marriage. It's such a brilliant novel. I don't know if any of you have read that, but I read it totally missing that it was inspired by the Odyssey until I heard her talking about it in an interview. And then I thought, oh, of course, I see the Odyssey. I see that underpinning, but you don't even have to know that to read the work and appreciate it. And she kind of does her own thing with it. So, there's a lot of different ways to approach adaptation. But what I think is so satisfying about adaptation is that it takes something we know and it transforms it through, an amazing magical process into its own new work of art that can stand alone as well as being in conversation with the original in some way. And so when I started, the Bacchae is one of my favorite plays, which is, sort of what this is drawing inspiration from. And I had really strong opinions about the Bacchae, and I loved the Bacchae, and I had read it many times, and I translated it, and I'd worked with it. And this completely overturned my understanding of the Bacchae. It came at the Bacchae from such a different perspective, and now I will never look at the Bacchae the same way. And that's what good adaptations can do, is that they can just completely go in and expand your idea of what the original text, if there was one original text, there may be many, can do.
It's interesting that you bring that up. That makes me think immediately of theater and of Shakespeare, as you brought up, that there's, folios and quartos and these different versions of the text, and even down to just a modern adaptation of the same text people are used to being just its own version of an original piece, but its own whole thing rather than just a recreation of some 400-year-old or 2,000-year-old in the case of some of these classics work of art. That's fascinating. So switching from the sort of inception of this book and that beginning of that adaptation to talking more about its current life and the sort of resurgence of its popularity, both as a positive popularity and having landed up on a couple of banned book lists. I know Iowa and Florida have different locations there have taken it off of the shelves. Where do you see either this book or just a category of literature that's classical, that's not even something new, being taken away from people to not be able to experience it at this moment? Where do you see a Song of Achilles within that scene?
I mean, first of all, I think it's completely shocking and appalling that queer books and so many more, I mean, Toni Morrison's Beloved are being pulled off the shelves. I'm still kind of stunned that it's happening. It's such a violent backlash to, I don't even know what, to people being happy, that I can't, I'm sort of like, I feel a little stunned by it. When it's also stunning to me from kind of, I mean, just to get like really technical here from a classical perspective, because the ancients absolutely saw Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. So are they going to pull Plato next? Like, what are, so where does it end? We can't have any. So I think it's such a, I really appreciate that you all have been a book sanctuary for this. And it's been, really appalling to see this happening, but it's been really appalling to see it. Like, Song of Achilles actually took a while for it to get banned, because I was hiding under classics, that a lot of people think like, well, it's classics, so it's okay. Like, classics has this really interesting relationship to modern culture, because sometimes it gets a pass, a little bit like how Shakespeare sometimes gets a pass, because it's seen to have sort of this like cultural cachet that people have given it. And so therefore it's kind of like, well, that's okay. I mean, the first like queer books that were banned were, by authors of color, of course. Like, it was interesting to see how that targeting happened. And it kind of took a while for it to be like, oh, wait, this is queer too. This is gay too. Get Song of Achilles out of here, because it sort of like that classics thing was almost like protection, which in some ways was a little bit of my point, which is that I wanted to say like, hey, queer people have been around for a long time. And, here's the Iliad, and you're picking it up to read about the Iliad, but actually this is a queer love story. And that was really important to me. And I have gotten a couple letters from people who, only a very few, from people who were expecting the Iliad, and they were expecting a certain type of view of the Iliad that they had come to expect perhaps from watching the movie The 300, which is also like filled with homoeroticism, by the way. But anyway, but this sort of idea of kind of this like particular type of interpreting the classics, and then we're very disturbed to see this. And I'm like, well, I guess you can't read Plato. I'm sorry. If that's too much for you, then you're not capable of actually interacting with history. So I guess I just, my heart goes out to all the librarians out there who are fighting the good fight, and all the theaters like you who are fighting the good fight, and all the people who are fighting the good fight to keep these books out there. And it's just baffling and bewildering to me and so disturbing. So thank you all for supporting People's Light, which is doing the right thing, and supporting your libraries, which are doing the right thing.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be a book sanctuary and have that be big and loud on our website so that, as things change in our area, we're still a good place for people to come for that kind of information. Sort of thinking about the shelter of the classics that sort of protected your work perhaps for quite a while from banned book lists. I'm thinking about who translates and who adapts works, and specifically Emily Wilson's recent translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad, and how she's brought a different perspective, just not even to adaptation, but to translation of those stories. Do you see, and then think about Madeleine George taking the Bacchae and traditionally male god Dionysus character into a female Diane. How do you see the voices through which we approach those older texts? Is it important or valuable to be getting that adaptation or translation from people who are not old white men in their, Ivy League leather libraries?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's so important that, you know, for a long time, this is just particular to the field of classics, but for a long time, the women who were in the field of classics were encouraged away from the big epics because it was seen as like those were the big important texts, and so therefore they needed to go to men, and women were kind of pushed towards like art history and love poetry. And so that's partially why it took so long for translations by women in English to come out of the big epic texts, because partially women were kind of kept out of that, and publishers, weren't investing in it. Interestingly enough, translations came out by women in other languages, but just not in English, which is interesting. I adore Emily Wilson. So if anyone is looking for a good translation of the Iliad or the Odyssey, I highly, highly recommend her works. They are brilliant, and she's such a ferocious intellect. I mean, her introduction to each work is like worth the price of admission, not even getting to the translation part. She's just so smart about how she thinks about literally translating, carrying across the work from its ancient form to this new form that she's working on. And I love how transparent Emily Wilson is too, how she says, all translation is interpretation, and we need to be aware of that. It's not some sort of like objective art. Every single word is a choice. I find personally translation way harder than novel writing. So I completely admire what she does, because I think it's incredibly difficult, and it takes amazing intellectual chops as well as artistic chops. It takes really both. But anyway, getting back to what you were saying, I mean, I think classics has this long history of gatekeeping, of it being only because it was considered, had this cultural cachet, it was considered only for certain people, and only certain people were kind of allowed to interact with it. And so I think it is so vital that we have all kinds of scholars coming into the field and using their eyes to look at things in new ways, and using their voices to tell the stories in new ways, and to see things in, through different lenses. I think that is so incredibly important. So I think that is the most hopeful thing that's happening in classics right now. I do think it's happening in classics. And it must happen. And I think it is. And I think we need all those new voices. And so sometimes people say, oh, I'm interested in writing about this, but it's been done. And I was like, yeah, but it hasn't been done by you. You do it. Let's hear it. Let's hear your version of it. Because we need all those different perspectives on it, and particularly perspectives that have been suppressed or have been pushed out of classics.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll just point out this is an oft-cited example of Emily Wilson's translation, but I think she uses the word at one point to muscular about the hands of a woman. That's
Yes.
often been translated as dainty or fine or careful, but the word means muscular, but because so many people who've translated that work before have assumed that a woman's hands can't be muscular, that sort of translation has been skipped over. So I think that has always stuck with me as such a great example of how bias can find its way into your translation and how a different perspective can bring a different literal meaning to even just the one word.
Absolutely. I love that example because I think, here's Penelope, it's describing Penelope's hands. And, she works at crafts all day. She weaves all day. That was heavy physical hand labor. Of course, your hands would be muscular. Of course they would. And her weaving is a key part of the Odyssey. And so, talking about the strength in her hands is a really important detail. And similarly, the fact that Emily Wilson uses the word slaves instead of servants. Servants really means something else to us versus enslaved people. And I think it's interesting that, so oftentimes people are also sort of trying to cover over those parts, those incredibly ugly parts. I mean, the ancient Greek world was heavily built on enslaved people. And I think it's the type of thing that we maybe don't like to talk about now, but it's really important to acknowledge that and to kind of have that there and to not sort of pretty it up just because we want to like Odysseus. First of all, I don't think Odysseus is particularly likable, but even if we want to, I think we need to see these things clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, not sanitizing the parts that are difficult to digest, but presenting them in a way that makes you choose to digest them and to confront them as you approach an adaptation.
Yeah, because I love classics, and so I love this material, but that doesn't mean I can't also be horrified by it or appalled by it or frustrated by it or feel like it's limited in many ways. Like those two things can happen at the same time.
Agreed. Absolutely. Pivoting a little bit to Hurricane Diane specifically, because I know you've got your visual aid of the
I know.
script there.
I every time I feel like I have to lift it up.
Um, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that piece of art as somebody who's obviously made your own adaptations, how you feel about this one or some of your favorite parts. If anyone here hasn't seen it yet, you've got 3 more chances, one of which is in half an hour, so there may be a couple of spoilers here, but it's worth chatting about because we have such a great perspective to share on it at the moment.
Well, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I'm going to try to avoid spoilers, but I do want to start by talking about the ending because I think the ending, all I'm going to say is that it feels the sort of final speeches of the characters feel so incredibly powerful. And I feel like every time I read them, I just feel like, yes, like this is getting at such a core moment that we are at right now, where how people have gotten so unable to give up what they know in order to do something that they know will make the world better because it will make their lives in some way slightly more uncomfortable or foreign or different. And it's such, I mean, I feel like Madeleine George just hits it right where we are. And it's such a powerful and devastating, but also so true and in some way rousing ending, that I feel like Madeleine George just manages to land the plane with so much excitement and power and so thought-provoking and so important. So sorry, I'm being so vague. I don't want to ruin it for people who haven't seen it, but you should all go see it. I mean, I love the fact that what we see with Dionysus as a figure is sort of that so much of it is about environmentalism and sort of the way we've come to look at the world and the way we've commodified the natural world. And, I'm so happy that in the years since I first read this, like that more people are moving away in some ways from sort of the dogma that we see the four women have in the beginning, that there are native plants and people are trying to make pollinator pathways and people, but like part of the point is that, no one person can do that. You sort of need everyone together working on it. so my personal reading of the Bacchae, I was always very sympathetic to the Pentheus figure, which is sort of the figure who resists Dionysus. So in the original Bacchae, which this is inspired by, the god Dionysus comes in and a bunch of people immediately kind of go over to Dionysus's worship, but this one person, Pentheus the king, stands aloof. And I always had a lot of sympathy for that, and reading this just completely overturned that, because I love a queer Diane. I love how Madeleine George imagines that character and how it completely changes that feeling of sort of taking over that happens in the Bacchae. It gets transformed into something else. It's just a truly brilliant transformation. It's a revelation, I think. And so you could absolutely go see the play and then read the Bacchae, but you don't need to read the Bacchae. I mean, the play is so funny, and the Bacchae is actually quite funny too. So I love how Madeleine George kind of picked up on that. Like, not a lot of Greek tragedy is a knee slapper territory, but the Bacchae does have some interesting comedic moments. And I like how Madeleine George has really developed that. So it manages, it's a comedy, it's a tragedy, it's a drama, it has everything.
And taking that and thinking even back to talking about adaptation and how every production of a script is different. There was recently a wonderful interview by Madeline George, the playwright of Rami, who plays Diane in our production, who has actually been Diane in 3 different productions of Hurricane Diane across the country. And in that, Rami talks about how different those 3 productions of a script that's word for word the same, right? You can't change it or cut it the way you could Shakespeare or a classic. So how different even those are. So that's a great read if you haven't had a chance to think about, even within this modern play, how every single interpretation truly is an adaptation. Fabulous. Those are all the questions that I really have that I wanted to chat about with you. I'd love to open it up to anybody in the Zoom with us for other questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or use the chat function and I can read them out to Madeline if you'd like. So take a second, whether it's about Hurricane Diane, adaptation, other favorite books, Song of Achilles itself. I know some folks in our library partners read Circe instead of Song of Achilles, so there's other things you're interested in asking about. We're lucky to have Madeline with us for another 15 minutes or so. So any questions or just comments that you want to make about these sort of works, feel free to throw those out there.
Okay, I'll start. Hi, I'm Kristen, and my question's a little bit off topic. So I've actually never read the Odyssey, although of course I'm familiar with the basic story. So my summer project is to read the Emily Wilson translation. And my question is, as a first-time reader, what things should I be looking for as I go through it? I know that's a very broad question.
Wow, no, that's a great question. So I think that I have a couple different thoughts. My first thought is there's a great audio version of Emily Wilson's translation. So if you are an audiobook person, or even just kind of hearing, 1 or 2 books done that way, 1 or 2 chapters done that way, might be interesting, because one thing to remember about the Iliad and the Odyssey is we think of them as texts today that are written down where you have to make notes and highlight, but the ancients experienced them like going to the movies. There was a bard who was performing them, singing them, accompanied by music, and you would go and be there like the theater. So a lot of times there can be a lot of names. This is not such an issue with the Odyssey. It's a little bit more of an Iliad issue, where there's like a long list of names, and it can feel like, is this name important? Do I need to remember this name? Do I need to know this? But just remember, it was experienced through oral tradition originally. So these names were just kind of drifting by and that's okay. So don't feel like you have to do homework. I think that's the main thing, is to sort of keep that in mind, but also keep in mind at the same time that that it was in context of all these other epic stories, that because these were oral tradition, they were stories that grandparents told their grandchildren and parents told their children, and they saturated the culture. So people knew the backstory to things. So, I don't want that to be daunting. I think Emily Wilson does an amazing job in her introduction of giving you what you need to know to read it. But if you do have that moment of like, this is alienating, I don't understand who this character is, why are they talking about Clytemnestra so much, she's not even in this, it's okay. It's just because you're not in ancient Greek. And that's why you're feeling that way. And so there's nothing wrong with you. And I think it can be easy to get lost in epics where, it's the first time reading it. My husband, can read Old Norse, and he has a bunch of the Old Norse epics. And I tried to read one the other day, and I got to my third Old Norse name, and I was like, I'm lost. Like, help me! You got to say this name for me because I can't pronounce it. So anyway, if you are experiencing any of those things, just know that it's because it's your first time reading it through, and that's okay. And it's okay to let some of that stuff just roll by, because Emily Wilson's translation does a great job of making it really exciting. And so it's okay to just kind of ride the excitement. You don't feel like you have to take notes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Fabulous. Other questions, comments? Feel free again to unmute yourself or use the chat, or in the YouTube viewers as well, feel free to throw it in the YouTube chat and I'll be able to read it out here.
And Kristen, you're in for such a treat. It's such a good translation. It really is. It's really fun.
I'm looking forward to it.
While people are thinking of other questions, I'd love to hear a little bit about how perhaps you see Circe fitting into this discussion we've been having. Song of Achilles is obviously a queer text, but focused on a sort of male perspective, but Circe being an investigation of a huge female figure in the mythology of around the Odyssey. So how do you see that text fitting into some of the things we've been discussing so far?
Well, in a way, I was doing something a little different with Circe and Song of Achilles. With Song of Achilles, I was very deliberately writing quite close to the material. And every time I made a change, I made it very deliberately and very reluctantly. The Iliad was my main source text for Song of Achilles. Because part of the argument that I was trying to make in Song of Achilles is that this love story is hiding in plain sight the whole time. That I'm not adding this in. I'm not, that this was absolutely one possible interpretation for their relationship in the ancient world. And you can see where that interpretation comes from in the Iliad. It's all sort of there already in many ways. And so part of what I wanted to do was kind of like flip the piece of embroidery over and show the backside. With Circe, I felt like I was doing something quite different, because the Circe episode in the Odyssey is narrated by Odysseus, and it's actually narrated by Odysseus to some people he's trying to impress. And as we know, Odysseus is the great liar of ancient literature, and he's constantly, spinning propaganda about himself and burnishing his own legend and trying to make himself look good. And so I sort of thought, well, I don't have to listen to anything he says. I can completely reach into this version of Circe that is described in the Odyssey, where she's like very attractive and she has this fancy hair and she seems to just kind of hang out all the time waiting for someone to show up. And then she like drifts sexily away. And, it's like, it's this total exoticized fantasy figure that is designed to make Odysseus look cool because he slept with her. And, I thought, well, I want her to have the agency, and I want to really kind of deconstruct and argue with Odysseus's version of this. So it was really fun to interact with it in a slightly different way. And the other way that the two works contrast for me is that Song of Achilles, I was taking an epic story and I was telling it from a very intimate perspective. I was trying to use sort of the voice of love poetry to tell what had always been an epic war story. But I was using the language, like my inspiration for the voice of Patroclus was coming from the world of love poetry. It was coming from Sappho and Catullus, much more than it was coming from Homer or Virgil. Whereas with Circe, women's lives were traditionally in the ancient world not considered important enough for epic. They feature in epic, but they don't lead their own epics. And so I wanted to take a woman's life and give it the full epic treatment. I wanted to set Circe at the center and have her meet gods and monsters and make horrific mistakes, as Achilles and Odysseus do in their respective epics. And and I also wanted to take sort of the aspects of women's lives and give them the epic treatment. So child rearing, childbirth, gardening, crafts, all those things play really an important role and an epic role in the story. Because I feel like they deserve importance and they are epic, even if they aren't traditionally considered epic. So in a way I was doing the same thing, and in a way I was actually doing something very different in the two pieces.
Great. We've got a question in the chat here, which feeds, I think, right into what you're saying. How do you feel your translations or adaptations rather are influenced by not being a man in a male-dominated field and genre? And we've touched on that a little bit in terms of you and Emily Wilson and the crowd of women making their foray into the classics. But in terms of that influence specifically, how do you escape that?
I mean, I have been very fortunate for the most part to have very supportive, although most of my professors were men, they were very supportive of me, which is, I would say, from my generation, not necessarily the typical. So I got very lucky in terms of that. But my feminist perspective is always with me. It's foundation, it's bedrock for me. My mom was a feminist. She raised me a feminist. And so, it's all there when I'm thinking about Circe. And one of the things that I get so frustrated by in sort of looking at these characters is just how incredibly flat they are women are in so many versions of the ancient myths, that either they don't have a motivation, they're just sort of there to be a prop to motivate someone else, or they're mysterious. That's Circe, right? She's unknowable. We can't ever know how she feels. Well, of course we can. She's a person. She has her own agency and her own feelings. And so partially it was about sort of reaching into her and supporting her subjectivity. So I tried to do that in very small ways where I was kind of talking back to the original. So one of the things I talked about, how Odysseus always describes her as being very, very attractive. And she has this fancy hair that he's constantly talking about. Circe of the beautiful braids is how it's often translated. It's kind of like prom hair. And so I decided to say, well, I want my Circe. Sure. Okay. I'll take the braids. But she braids her hair because she's constantly in the woods digging up stuff and hanging out with her lions and wolves. And, you'd put your hair up. That makes sense. So sometimes I would keep what the text said, but I would just change the interpretation for it. Odysseus can think it's some fabulous new divine goddess hairstyle, but actually it's very practical from her perspective. So just making sure that I had transformed it in all sorts of ways. And looking at also kind of like the expectations for women. Circe definitely has a number of lovers over the course of the book. And she has the freedom for that. And so I wanted that to be part of it. Odysseus definitely does. He sleeps his way across the Mediterranean in the Odyssey. And so, just kind of looking at that kind of stuff. But most of all, I actually wanted to minimize Odysseus's role in the book, that so many times when we get retellings of Circe, they're all around Odysseus. And I really wanted to just compress him to this very small cameo in her life, just like she's a very small cameo in his life. And that cameo has important repercussions, but she's only in kind of 2+ books of the Odyssey. And so Odysseus is in 2+ chapters of the novel. And I did that on purpose. Because I wanted to keep him in his sphere. And I think the final piece also is that I wanted to look at ways that, when you're oppressing 50% of the population, i.e. all the women in these ancient stories, that there are men too who are being put in situations that they don't want to be in, that they also are being constricted in terms of the roles, that this is not a zero-sum game, that it isn't about if we give from women, we take from men. This is about, these constricted roles and these rules harm women, but also they harm men. And so there are characters in the novel who are men who are also struggling with sort of the path that's been laid down for them, that they don't want to live that way. In particular, Telemachus, in my version, Odysseus's son, looks at his father's life and just sees kind of blood and death, and he doesn't want to be a Mycenaean prince. So all of that was kind of swirling around. And I have to say that writing Song of Achilles was great practice, because by the time I got to Circe, I was very nervous during a lot of the time I was writing Song of Achilles about how classicists would feel about it and, all of that. And by the time I got to Circe, I was like, no, I don't care. I'm doing it, and that's fine.
Fabulous. We've got another sort of comment in the chat, specifically more about the Song of Achilles as you've interpreted the story. Speaking on the romance at the center of it. This person says they're paraphrasing badly, but it's well paraphrased. The half seconds when our gazes met were the only times I felt anything at all. And saying how that was one of the most accurate things about love and depression that they've ever found in a piece of text anywhere. So, not to ask you to get too personal or anything like that, but where does the strength of that love come from? Again, they go on to say that how the way that Patroclus couldn't let go of Achilles' body when he died being such a signifier for you of the fact that they were romantic partners. So how did you dive into what some people, including myself, have found like a truly moving romantic story and mining that from the text?
Thank you. First of all, thank you. Thank you so much. And you can say Patroclus or Patroclus. I was taught Patroclus, but Patroclus, I think, is more common at this point. So there's no right way, it's all the different versions that people get taught. But when I was thinking about their relationship, I really just kept coming back to that moment in the Iliad, which, this is a huge spoiler for the Iliad, so I apologize. But where Patroclus is killed, and Achilles, who's been telling us that he doesn't care about anything except for his reputation, suddenly just completely loses everything. It's like this bomb exploding for him. And he is overwhelmed with grief and with rage and with even the desire to possibly kill himself. And he, is so undone by this character who's been really like a minor character in all of the Iliad, just sort of there with Achilles. Achilles is most beloved companion, but we don't really see any of their relationship. And so I felt like what Homer was doing in that moment was showing us the end of their relationship. This is this end, this last desperate moment, but what is the beginning? What does the beginning look like? And so I really set that moment on my horizon and kind of wrote towards it. And I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the fact that they grew up together. And I think that there is something very special about people who knew each other as children. That they sort of are friends first, and they go through a lot together, and they have this real vulnerability and real intimacy with each other. And yes, Patroclus is extremely depressed. I mean, he has a very traumatic childhood for a number of reasons. And, he feels alone in the world. And then he meets Achilles. And, sometimes I think that relationship could go in a bad direction. And I think you could even argue that there are things about their relationship that are, troubling at moments, particularly as it goes on and we see, how Achilles is evolving. But part of what I love about Achilles, the figure of Achilles, is that I feel like this is, I'm getting this from the Iliad, is that there is this innocence to him, that early on he has this sort of desire to do the right thing that seems missing from a lot of other people. He has this earnestness and this openness to him. I mean, he says at one point he hates like the gates of death, the man who says one thing and hides another in his heart, which is, P.S. like the definition of Odysseus, saying one thing and hiding another thing in your heart. So it's interesting too that Achilles and Odysseus are like the anchors of these two epics because they're so different from each other. So I just kept thinking about the level of Achilles's grief. And who was this person, that actually Patroclus was sort of the soul of Achilles all along, that he was his core, and he was the thing that kind of held him down to earth. And I thought a lot about what it meant to be caught between the world of gods and humans, and to have this incredibly empathetic person there kind of keeping your feet on the ground in the world of humanity. And again, these were things I sort of, there's not much about Patroclus in the Iliad, but there are two references to him, one being always gentle and one being kind to everyone. And those were really inspiring to me as I built the character of Patroclus, and it's very atypical, as you know, as a classicist, that is not a typical way that ancient heroes are described, always gentle and kind to everyone. It's like, I sack a lot of cities, I get a lot of gold, I throw good parties, I'm good at the battle cry, I throw the spear well. All those are sort of like typical descriptors, but not kind to everyone and always gentle. So all of that sort of went into this relationship as I was thinking about the two of them, is this innocence that Achilles has, and the fact that in another life, Achilles might have been an Orpheus figure. He might have been a great artist. He's an amazing musician. Or he might have been an Asclepius figure, a doctor, that he has these skills, but instead he becomes, a murderer. And how those pieces of him are cherished by Patroclus and very much present. So all of that was kind of in my mind. And it was interesting to get a little feedback very, very early on about someone from an early reader who wanted more conflict in their relationship. And I was like, no, that's not, the conflict is external. I mean, yes, they have conflict mostly over sort of what happens once the war, once we hit the Iliad portion of the story. But actually, they truly understand each other, and they're loyal to each other and intimate and vulnerable, and they truly love each other. And that was really important to me, particularly because so many queer stories are told as tragedies, and because I knew that the ending was going to be a tragedy. So it was really important to me that their relationship actually was not a tragedy, that it was a true and deep and real bond.
That definitely comes through. I remember crying over this in high school, and so and the depth of feeling with them is in every word in the book. We're coming up towards the end of the time. If anyone has a last short question of any kind, we have space for one more if anybody's got one, either in the chat or unmuting yourself. Great. Well, Madeline, this was awesome. Go ahead, Kristen.
Less a question than just a compliment, kind of based off what you just said. When I read Song of Achilles, like obviously the ending, it's not going to end well, and yet I was so compelled by the relationship. So like kudos on that, because it really kept me reading.
Thank you so much. That is so kind of you.
Yeah, so many people have been touched by that book specifically and refer to it, and everyone knows, oh yes, that book in rooms I've been in. So it's been a big part of my journey as a queer person as well, and I want to thank you for that too, and thank you for joining us for this interview. For everyone else, you've 2 more chances to see Hurricane Diane. You actually have 3, but one of them starts in 10 minutes. So if you're not there already, you're probably not going to see it. But please come and join us for one of our 2 remaining performances. Also tomorrow after the matinee, we're going to be in this room that I'm actually in, if people want to have any kind of in-person discussion about Song of Achilles or that kind of thing as well. So if any of your friends couldn't make this chat today, send them my way tomorrow afternoon. But otherwise, Madeline, thank you so much for your time, and happy trails, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you
Bye.
so much for having me. Thanks everyone for listening and for your questions.